Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side.
Imagine growing up in a small conservative town where everyone knows your name, but not your truth. A place where secrets thrive alongside gossip, and being different can make you a target. For Leon Laureles, a kind-hearted and selfless man from Brownwood, Texas, this was his reality. Life wasn't easy for Leon, but you'd never know it from the way he carried himself. From a young age, Leon put the needs of others before his own, quietly shouldering more than most people ever would. He was the kind of person who could light up a room, even when his own world felt impossibly heavy. But in May of 1996, that light was extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Leon was shot execution style, his car set on fire in what appeared to be a deliberate act of violence. His murder shook the small town of Brownwood, but not enough to spark real justice. Instead, whispers of a hate crime, questionable law enforcement practices, and a mishandled investigation left his family to fight for answers alone. Nearly 3 decades later, those answers are still out of reach.
This story isn't just about a life cut short. It's about a system that failed Leon and a community that still hasn't reckoned with its own prejudice. Today, we'll uncover the layers of this deeply troubling case, honor Leon's memory, and amplify the voice of his niece, Arlene, who has dedicated her life to seeking justice for the uncle she loved so dearly. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about resilience, truth, and the unrelenting fight against hate. It's about a man who deserved so much more than the world gave him, and a family determined to ensure his legacy is never forgotten. I'm Gina.
And I'm Amber.
And this is the story of Leon Laureles.
Brownwood, Texas, is a small town in Central Texas located about 140 miles northwest of Austin and 78 miles southeast of Abilene. Back in 1996, its population was just over 18,000, a number that hasn't changed much in the decades since. Like many small towns, Brownwood offered the comfort of familiarity. Everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower pace. But under the surface, it was a town deeply resistant to change, with long-standing prejudices that shaped the lives of those that didn't fit its mold. Leon Laureles grew up in this environment, though his early years weren't spent in Brownwood. He was born on January 3, 1966, in Mason, Texas, the youngest of 9 children in a Mexican Catholic immigrant family. His siblings were much older. His closest sibling was 12 years his senior, so Leon essentially grew up as an only child. This large age gap meant that Leon's relationships with his nieces and nephews were closer than those with his own siblings, particularly his niece Arlene, who was only 2 years younger. Their bond was more like that of siblings, and they remained close throughout Leon's life. Leon's childhood was marked by hardship. By the time he was just 10 years old, his siblings had moved out, and his parents were seriously ill. With no one else to take on the responsibility, Leon became the primary caregiver in the household. At an age when most kids are playing outside or focused on school, Leon was cooking meals, cleaning the house, running errands, and driving his parents to medical appointments after earning his driver's permit at just 14. His responsibilities often meant missing school, but Leon still managed to excel when he could attend.
Despite everything he had to carry, Leon remained kind and caring. Friends described him as someone who was always generous, always smiling, no matter what was happening in his life. One of Leon's greatest joys was music. He joined the marching band at Brady High School and became an accomplished trumpet player. His niece Arlene often visited him to listen to him practice, amazed at how effortlessly he played. She played the saxophone, but joked she wasn't very good. Music became a shared connection between them, a bright spot in an otherwise challenging childhood. Leon and Arlene's bond ran deeper than shared interests. Both had difficult upbringings and often felt overlooked or unwanted, which drew them closer. Leon became a source of comfort for Arlene, picking her up from school when her mom forgot or simply showing up when she needed someone. In their small Texas town, where being different wasn't easily accepted, they found solace in each other's company. Leon's love for family was evident, especially during the holidays. He adored cooking for everyone and took pride in bringing people together. His love for music extended beyond his trumpet to his favorite pop icons like Madonna and Celine Dion. In a town where cowboy boots and country music dominated, Leon unapologetically danced to his own beat, a quiet act of defiance that spoke to who he was.
After high school, Arlene's life took a challenging turn. She married young and had her first child, but her husband was abusive. Before her son's second birthday, Arlene left the marriage, and without hesitation, Leon stepped in to help. He became a vital part of their household, watching her son while she worked and supporting her in any way he could. When Arlene remarried and had 2 more boys, history repeated itself. Her second husband was also abusive, and once again, Leon was there to help her through the tough times. He worked the graveyard shift at Kroger, but that didn't stop him from caring for Arlene's children during the day. He taught them their ABCs, their colors, and even how to write their names. Arlene often called Leon a father figure to her boys, a role he took on without complaint. One of her most touching memories is how Leon always seemed to know when she was struggling. He didn't wait for her to ask for help, he just showed up. Whether it was watching the boys, making sure they were fed, or simply offering emotional support, Leon's presence was constant and unwavering. Leon wasn't just an uncle, he was the glue that held his family together. It wasn't just the big gestures that defined him, it was the small, everyday acts of kindness. Even as he juggled his own work and personal dreams, he made sure the people he cared about never felt alone.
But Leon was also starting to think about himself for a change. In the months before his death, he began carving out small spaces of freedom and community. One of his favorite places was a small coffee shop in Brownwood, a rare safe haven in the conservative town. The shop was owned by an ally who welcomed everyone, and for Leon, it was a place where he could finally breathe and be himself. At the coffee shop, Leon struck up a friendship with Steve Harris, an openly gay man who worked there. For the first time, Leon had someone to confide in, someone who truly understood the struggles of being gay in a small conservative town. Leon shared his excitement about the idea of coming out, expressing how much he wanted to live authentically. But he also revealed his disappointment that the man he was dating wasn't ready to take that step with him. Despite the fear of rejection and the looming shadow of homophobia in Brownwood, Leon was hopeful. The coffee shop became more than a hangout. It was a glimpse into a life where he could fully be himself. But that life was stolen before Leon could take those next steps. His bravery in even considering coming out speaks volumes about the kind of person he was. Leon deserved acceptance and love, not the hatred and violence that ultimately ended his life.
In the weeks leading up to his murder, Leon started sharing concerns about his safety with a few trusted people. At Kroger, he told coworkers that he had been harassed and threatened. While he didn't share who was behind the threats, his fear was obvious. These warnings, paired with strange incidents in the day before his death, painted a troubling picture. Leon had recently confronted members of the Northside Posse, a local group notorious for theft and drug activity. They had been stealing from Kroger regularly, and Leon had made it clear he wouldn't tolerate it anymore. Standing up to a group with a reputation for violence likely made him a target, but Leon's fears seemed to go beyond them. 2 weeks before his murder, Leon's cousin saw him at a local park, talking to someone in a little red sports car. Across the street, 2 men sat in a black car watching them closely. The cousin made sure the men saw him and then approached Leon after the red car drove away. When asked who he was talking to, Leon said it was a friend, a doctor at the local hospital.
Just days after his cousin saw Leon at the park talking to the man in the red sports car, another strange encounter occurred. This time, The cousins spotted Leon sitting in his black 1988 Thunderbird, parked in the Blockbuster parking lot across the street from the Kroger. When asked what he was doing, Leon explained that he was waiting for his quote-unquote girlfriend, but then he shared something far more alarming. The woman's father, a law enforcement officer, had threatened to kill him if they were caught together. Arlene, reflecting on this moment, believes Leon wasn't being entirely truthful, at least not in the way it sounded. She speculates that Leon likely used girlfriend and daughter as stand-ins for boyfriend and son. Given that Leon wasn't out to his family, it's a heartbreaking possibility. This moment, paired with the threats that Leon had mentioned earlier, only deepened the concerns about his safety. It was clear he felt that he was in danger, but what or who was driving this fear wasn't fully clear. The next day, just one day before his murder, Leon visited his sister Lily in Bangs, Texas. During their conversation, Leon told her that two brothers associated with the North Side Posse were after him. He didn't understand why, but it was enough to trouble him. At the time, Lily didn't think it was an immediate threat, and Leon didn't press the issue. But in hindsight, this was yet another sign that the danger was closing in.
When you look back at all these moments, the threats, the strange cars, and the warning about the brothers, it paints a chilling picture of someone being hunted. Leon seemed to know something was wrong, but he likely had no idea just how close the danger really was. On the night of May 9th, 1996, Leon left the home he shared with his brother George around 11:30 p.m., heading to work at Kroger for his midnight shift. A coworker saw him pull into the parking lot at 11:45 p.m. in his black 1988 Thunderbird. But something was different that night. Leon didn't park in his usual spot. Another vehicle was already there, a small detail that, in hindsight, feels chilling. Leon parked next to it, but he never made it inside Kroger. By midnight, when Leon hadn't clocked in, the coworker who had seen him arrive noticed his car was gone. Concerned, she called George to ask if Leon had returned home. George immediately set out, driving the route Leon usually took to work, but found no sign of him. The coworker also called the police to report Leon missing and asked if there had been any accidents or incidents. The dispatcher mentioned only one call, a report of a car fire outside of town.
When George returned home, he called Kroger for an update. As the coworker answered, a fire truck passed by with its sirens blaring. Within minutes, the horrifying truth of what had happened to Leon would begin to unfold. At 12:22 a.m., Brownwood 911 dispatch received a call reporting a car on fire along FM 2126 near a gun range and railroad tracks. The caller, a group of people who had been drinking and driving, described a red and white Ford pickup truck behind the burning car, but didn't stop to help or give their names to the dispatcher. Shortly after, a second call came in, this time from a registered nurse driving home after her hospital shift. Unlike the first callers, she stopped to help. What she found was devastating. Leon's car was engulfed in flames, and just a few feet away, his body lay on the ground. She quickly realized there was nothing she could do. Leon was already gone. The trauma of that night stayed with her for the rest of her life, a haunting reminder of the violence she had stumbled upon.
When emergency responders arrived, they confirmed what the RN had discovered. Leon had been shot execution style. A .38 caliber bullet entered the back of his head, exited through the front, and lodged in his hand, likely raised in a defensive attempt. His body hadn't been burned, which meant he was likely killed before his car was set on fire. The Thunderbird, however, was destroyed beyond recognition, erasing what could have been vital evidence. As the news of Leon's death spread, Arlene and her family rushed to the Brown County Sheriff's Office desperate for answers. But instead of support, they were met with cold indifference. The women, including Arlene, weren't allowed inside the building. They stood outside, confused and heartbroken, while Leon's brother George went in to speak with the authorities. No one came out to explain what had happened. All they knew was that Leon had been shot. Nothing more. This treatment set the tone for what was to come. Law enforcement's dismissive attitude made it clear that getting answers, or even basic respect, was going to be a battle. As if that wasn't enough, the media's handling of Leon's case only added to the family's pain. While they waited for answers, Arlene overheard someone mention that the details of Leon's murder had already been published in the local paper. That's how she learned her uncle had been shot execution style, not from the police, but from the newspaper. Furious, she drove to the paper's office to confront them, but it was too late. The damage was done, and it was yet another blow to a family already reeling.
A few days later, a reporter showed up at the family's home, but instead of listening to everyone's story, she insisted on interviewing George and dismissed Arlene when she tried to contribute. Arlene recalls the reporter getting visibly annoyed with her for speaking up, adding to the growing feeling that Leon's story and his family's grief weren't being taken seriously. For decades, Arlene has fought to keep Leon's case in the spotlight, but despite her tireless efforts, local newspapers have refused to cover it. His story remained ignored until recently, and even then, it was only briefly mentioned on local radio on the anniversary of his death. Almost immediately, the investigation started going off the rails. Brown County Sheriff Bill Donahue recused himself from the case due to a supposed conflict of interest, though no explanation was ever given for what that conflict was. And he recused himself the night of the murder when he showed up to the scene. He's just like, nope, I'm out. And with Donahue stepping aside, the case was handed over to the Texas Rangers, specifically Ranger Bobby Grubbs, who would later become Brown County's sheriff. Grubbs is the detective who refused to speak to any of Leon's female relatives.
Not so shockingly, evidence from the scene was mishandled or outright destroyed. Leon's Thunderbird, a critical piece of evidence, was immediately taken to a junkyard and later destroyed. The bullet that killed Leon, a .38 caliber round, commonly used by law enforcement, was placed in a bag and stored in a deputy's desk drawer instead of an evidence locker. It has since been lost. When Arlene asked about Leon's clothing or other items from the scene, she was told that no evidence had been kept. Early in the investigation, Grubbs pushed the narrative that Leon's murder was drug-related. The night after the murder, Grubbs visited Kroger to question Leon's co-workers, trying to coerce them into saying Leon was involved with the Northside Posse and their drug activities. The Northside Posse was well known in Brownwood for running a drug trafficking operation, and Grubbs suggested that Leon brought the violence upon himself by associating with such people. But there was no evidence to support this theory, and no witnesses ever came forward to say Leon was involved with the group. His autopsy confirmed there were no drugs in his system, and no drugs were found in his home, car, or workplace. While members of the Northside Posse were undoubtedly involved in illegal activities, Arlene believes this drug theory was simply a way for law enforcement to shift focus away from the real motive for Leon's murder. It was easier to pin his death on connections to the drug ring than to confront the possibility that his murder might have been a hate crime.
The deputies on the scene didn't wear protective gear, trampling potential evidence where Leon's body was found. Witnesses who claimed to have relevant information were dismissed, especially if their stories didn't align with the drug narrative. When George, Leon's brother, eventually asked Grubbs for the case file, all Grubbs could produce were 2 small pieces of paper with notes. That was it. 2 sticky notes representing the entirety of the investigation into Leon's death. Wow. Yeah. The mishandling of evidence The lack of proper investigative procedures and the clear bias in how Leon's case was treated sent a clear message. This murder wasn't going to be taken seriously. For Leon's family, it was a devastating blow. Not only had they lost someone they loved, but they were left to fight against a system that seemed determined to let his killers go unpunished. This realization led George and Arlene to hire a private investigator to dig into Leon's death. But it would be decades later when Arlene discovered what the PI had found.
The discovery came when her Uncle George handed over poster boards the investigator had made. George had received them several months after Leon's death, late 96, early 97, but was so devastated by the findings that he put them in a closet and never discussed them. The trauma of losing Leon, facing the truth about his sexuality, and reading the names of the men who caused him harm was too much to bear. Sometimes we just aren't ready to open up old wounds, and that's exactly what happened to George. Arlene was understandably angry these findings had been buried away for so long, but after she struggled to look at the evidence, she gained empathy. After assuming the PI hadn't found anything, what she uncovered painted a chilling picture of a meticulously planned crime. The private investigator identified 3 main suspects in Leon's murder. These individuals were not strangers to law enforcement. They were known to be violent, had criminal records, and were part of a tightly knit community that operated with impunity in Brownwood. The first suspect was a deputy who also served as an arson investigator. This deputy's son was a friend of Leon's, and Arlene believed he is the same deputy who had threatened Leon in the Blockbuster parking lot just days before the murder. That deputy was on duty the night Leon was killed.
The other 2 suspects were brothers and known members of the Northside Posse. These men were not only drug dealers, but were also known to do favors for local law enforcement, which often turned a blind eye to their illegal activities. According to someone who worked with them, these brothers were openly hateful towards LGBTQ individuals and minorities, making it clear that Leon's identity may have made him a target. According to the PI's notes, these 3 suspects had carefully planned Leon's murder. They knew his work schedule, where he parked at Kroger, and likely waited for him to arrive that night. The PI theorized that Leon was confronted by the younger suspects in the Kroger parking lot at 11:45 p.m. shortly after he arrived. From there, it's believed that Leon was either forced to follow the suspects to the crime scene, or that one of the suspects drove his Thunderbird while the other drove the vehicle seen in the parking lot. By 12:22 a.m., less than 45 minutes after Leon was last seen, his burning car was reported to 911, and his body was found shot execution style beside it. The timeline suggests this was a swift, deliberate act, leaving little room for doubt that the crime was premeditated.
As for the motive, the deputy was reportedly angry about Leon's friendship with his son, believing it reflected poorly on him in their small, conservative town. A week after the murder, a witness overheard one of the suspects bragging at a house party about killing Leon because he was, quote, fucking with his little brother, end quote. The witness reported this to the sheriff, but nothing was ever investigated. 2 other people later came forward with similar information, but again, no action was taken. The story doesn't stop there. In the hours after Leon's murder, Sheriff Donahue's son, the same sheriff who recused himself, showed up at Kroger frantically looking for Leon. This raised more questions, as he had never visited Leon at work before. Through some of her own investigative work, Arlene found DMV records showing that the sheriff owned a truck matching the description of the red and white one seen at the crime scene. That truck hasn't been seen since that night and remains registered in the sheriff's name. Its disappearance is one of the many unanswered questions in Leon's case. The private investigator only worked on the case for a short time before being threatened by locals and stepping away. He never took on another case again. What his findings reveal, however, is a disturbing picture of a small-town corruption, deep-seated prejudice, and a coordinated effort to ensure Leon's murder was never properly investigated.
From the very beginning, Leon's case wasn't just mishandled, it was outright neglected. Leon was a Hispanic gay man living in a predominantly conservative white town in the 1990s. Brownwood, Texas wasn't exactly a welcoming place for someone like Leon, especially with homophobia running rampant at the time. Even though Leon wasn't out publicly, somehow investigators seemed to know he was gay, and that fact appeared to color the entire investigation. Arlene believes that, to the people in power, Leon was considered lesser than, and his life was treated as if it didn't matter. In 2004, Bobby Grubbs, who had been the Texas Ranger assigned to Leon's case, was elected as Brown County Sheriff. He often claimed that solving Leon's murder was one of his top priorities. But based on the sticky notes and the drug-related narrative he pushed early on, it's hard to believe he ever intended to uncover the truth. For Arlene, the answer is clear. This was an inside job, and the system worked to protect itself. It doesn't take much digging to see how the investigation into Leon's murder was compromised from the start. The morning after his death, photos published in the Brownwood Bulletin showed the deputies standing in the middle of the crime scene. Standard protocol calls for wearing protective gear like gloves and booties to preserve the evidence, but none of them were wearing any. They were literally standing where Leon's body had been found. Literally in the spot where his body was. Just destroying any evidence that was there.
And the missteps didn't stop there. Among the deputies at the scene was a man in plain clothes, later identified as Groner Pitts. Pitts wasn't law enforcement. He was the property owner where Leon's body was found. At the time, he was also the town's undertaker. Why was Pitts at the crime scene that night? No explanation has ever been given, adding another layer of suspicion. What happened afterward only deepened the family's doubts about the investigation. At the funeral home, Arlene and her family were told not to view Leon's face because it had been deformed from lying in an ant pile at the scene. But Arlene, who has visited the site multiple times over the years, has never seen ants in that area. The claim was not only bizarre, but also eerily similar to another unsolved case in Brownwood. 7 years before Leon's death, 13-year-old Amanda Goodman was found executed in a disturbingly similar fashion just 10 miles outside of town. Like Leon, she was shot and left near the roadside. Witnesses reporting seeing Amanda get into a red and white pickup truck, the same description as the truck seen at Leon's crime scene. And like Leon's family, Amanda's parents were told not to view her face because it had been deformed from lying in an ant pile. The parallels are impossible to ignore, raising serious questions about whether these two cases are connected.
The autopsy report for Leon added yet another layer of confusion. It took Arlene 26 years to get a copy of the report, and when she did, it was riddled with issues. It was only 7 pages long, missing critical details, and lacked an official seal or signature. Even stranger, Leon's autopsy was conducted in Travis County, not Tarrant County, where autopsies from Brown County are usually performed. The timeline didn't make sense either. Leon's body arrived in Travis County at 7 a.m. on May 10th, and the autopsy was completed by 9 a.m., and his body was back in Brownwood at the funeral home by 2 p.m. the same day. Yet the autopsy report itself was dated May 13th. I compared Leon's report to another autopsy performed by the same medical examiner, Dr. Alberto Bayardo, and the differences are glaring. The other report, conducted just weeks earlier for Stacy Stites, who's also a well-known case, her autopsy was twice as long, detailed, and properly signed, and also had the Travis County Medical Examiner seal on it, on every single page. Leon's report looked incomplete and frankly suspicious. When Arlene requested the case file from the current Brown County judge, Doug Hurt, the excuses started piling up. First, he claimed he wasn't familiar with Leon's case. Then, he said the records had been destroyed in a flood that never happened. Floods do not happen in Brownwood, Texas. When pressed further, he finally provided a copy of this 7-page autopsy report. But like I said, it wasn't on official letterhead or properly signed. A Cold Case Coalition member later confirmed that it didn't appear to be a legitimate autopsy report, and Arlene was also told by someone in the sheriff's office that Leon's files had never been digitized, but this autopsy report is suddenly digitized. It doesn't make any sense.
In 2021, Arlene reached out to a Texas Ranger for an update. She was told that the main suspect in Leon's case had committed suicide. The only person with ties to the case who had died by suicide was Sheriff Donahue's son, the man who was frantically looking for Leon the night of his murder. Arlene doesn't believe this explanation for a second. To her, it felt like a convenient way to close the case by pinning the blame on someone who couldn't defend themselves. She suspects the sheriff's son may have gone to Kroger that night to warn Leon he was in danger. But if that's true, the warning came too late. The ripple effects of Leon's murder didn't just touch his family. They devastated everyone who cared about him and even those who only crossed paths with him that night. The RN who stopped at the scene and called 911 carried the trauma of that moment with her for the rest of her life. The image of Leon's body and the knowledge that she couldn't save him haunted her. One of Leon's co-workers also couldn't bear the weight of his loss. The lack of progress in the investigation and the indifference surrounding his case broke her heart. She eventually left Brownwood altogether, unable to continue living and working in a place where justice for Leon felt so far out of reach.
For those who were closest to Leon, the aftermath has been filled with guilt, regret, and anxiety. Survivors often replay the events in their minds, wondering if there was something, anything, they could have done to change the outcome. For Arlene, this pain was so intense that she couldn't even talk about Leon for years after his death. She moved to San Diego, desperate to escape the weight of the case and the town where it happened. But even miles away, the silence around Leon's murder became too much. Arlene realized she had to be the one to speak up for him because no one else would. She returned to Texas determined to advocate for justice. It's impossible to ignore the bitter reality that the people involved in Leon's murder have continued to live their lives in Brownwood. They've started businesses, gotten married, and had families, all while Leon was robbed of the chance to do the same. He was a good, kind-hearted person who deserved so much more. He deserved to live a full life, to find love, and to have a family of his own.
Arlene hasn't stopped fighting for Leon. She's called for anyone with evidence to come forward and has continued to push for answers. She still doesn't have access to Leon's full autopsy because the current sheriff has refused to provide it. She needs the help of an attorney to obtain it, someone willing to stand by her and help unravel the stonewalling that's plagued this case. If anyone is or knows an attorney that can help, it could be a critical step forward. There's also the question of Leon's body. Arlene believes it needs to be exhumed for another examination. Modern forensic technologies could uncover evidence that was missed during the initial autopsy. Given that Leon's murder was very likely a hate crime, Arlene also believes the FBI should be involved. It's a fight that isn't just about bringing Leon's killers to justice. It's about ensuring his story is heard and that his life is honored. For Arlene, Leon's family, and the friends he left behind, the fight for justice isn't over. It won't be over until the truth is finally brought to light.
I want want to take a moment to thank Arlene Harbison for sharing her Uncle Leon's story with us and for her tireless efforts to keep his memory alive. If you'd like to hear more from Arlene, be sure to check out her podcast, Box in the Basement, where she dives deeper into Leon's case and other stories of injustice. You can also find more information about Leon's case and ways to support Arlene's fight for justice by visiting justiceforleon.com. We will include links in the show notes. If any of our amazing listeners have a case, personal or otherwise, that needs to be shared, please share it with us by filling out the contact form on our website, weirdtruecrime.com, or emailing us at weirdtruecrime@gmail.com. If you like what you hear, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast app. We will shout you out and read your review on a future episode. Until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices. Bye.
Bye.